The bitter winter winds of December 1944 swept across the Ardennes, carrying with them the anticipation of a battle that would become one of the most famous and brutal in history. The Battle of the Bulge. German commanders believed their armored formations could steamroll the thinly held American lines. Yet they were about to encounter a technological shock that would alter the course of the conflict. The introduction of proximity fuses in Allied artillery shells. These fuses, designed to detonate not on impact but in proximity to enemy targets, unleashed destruction unlike anything the German army had faced. Whole formations, tanks, infantry units, and armored vehicles were suddenly vulnerable to invisible, unseen explosions that tore through ranks with terrifying precision. Soldiers on both sides would later describe the first encounters with a mixture of awe and horror, as artillery bursts rained down not randomly, but with a terrifying accuracy that made the battlefield itself feel alive, hunting and striking at will. From the very first volley, it was clear that the rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted. German units advancing through snow-covered forests and frozen roads were obliterated without warning. Commanders were left staring at maps that no longer reflected reality, as units that should have been cohesive were shredded by artillery detonations that occurred mere feet above the ground. Tanks were lifted, overturned, or shredded. Infantry formations dissolved in a storm of shrapnel and fire. The American gunners, positioned safely behind the lines, watched as their secret weapon wrought chaos, a silent predator that spared no one in its deadly arc. Letters, diaries, and oral histories later captured the incredulity of German soldiers, many of whom initially thought they were under attack from an unseen aerial assault or some unprecedented form of American magic. The technology itself was revolutionary. Unlike conventional artillery shells, which required direct impact, proximity fuses contained sensitive mechanisms that detonated when they detected the presence of masked targets within a certain radius. This meant that tightly packed formations, a hallmark of blitzkrieg tactics, became death traps. Infantry, tanks, and trucks, which had previously been able to move with speed and confidence, now faced an invisible, omnipresent threat that could strike without warning. The Germans attempted to adjust formations, scatter units, and use terrain as cover, yet the effectiveness of the fuses made traditional countermeasures almost irrelevant. Snow-covered fields and frozen roads became open graves, while the forested Ardennes offered only limited protection from the aerial arcs of exploding shells. The first engagements demonstrated not only the destructive power of the fuses but also their psychological impact. German soldiers reported that the air itself seemed to carry danger, that artillery bursts exploded overhead with uncanny timing, and that entire units could be wiped out before realizing what had happened. Commanders attempted to reorganize, but fear and confusion spread like wildfire. In addition to physical devastation, morale collapsed in many units. Soldiers became hesitant to advance. Trucks moved slowly through anticipated kill zones, and panic began to undermine operational cohesion. Even experienced tank commanders, trained in maneuver warfare, found their tactics rendered obsolete, unable to protect their crews from detonations that occurred above. Beside or in front of them, the Americans, aware of the psychological edge provided by proximity fuses, coordinated fire missions to maximize their impact. Batteries fired in staggered, overlapping patterns, ensuring that advancing enemy columns could not find safe zones. Observers calculated trajectories, altitude, and timing with meticulous precision, combining human skill with the revolutionary technology. The result was catastrophic for German forces. Every advance became a perilous gamble, every concentration of troops a target for annihilation. The cumulative effect of these missions created a sense of inevitability, as though the fuses themselves were orchestrating the destruction, turning the once feared blitzkrieg machine into a fractured, vulnerable army. On the ground, the consequences were visceral. Soldiers described tanks being ripped apart mid-column, trucks turned into flaming wrecks, and infantry scattered by bursts that showered them with metal fragments. Medical personnel struggled to cope with the influx of casualties, often working in freezing conditions under intermittent fire. The landscape of the Ardennes was transformed. Forests that had provided cover were now scarred by explosions, roads were littered with wreckage, and villages were shaken by the relentless detonations. The proximity fuse had not only physical effects, but strategic ones, buying the Allies time, inflicting staggering casualties, and destabilizing the German offensive at its most critical moment. As the Battle of the Bulge progressed, the cumulative impact of proximity fuses became undeniable. Tactical plans were rewritten, command structures disrupted, and the once cohesive German advance slowed to a crawl. Soldiers on both sides came to recognize the fuse as more than a weapon. It was a force multiplier, an invisible hand that reshaped engagements, dictated battlefield outcomes, and redefined modern artillery. Letters from officers to headquarters praised its effectiveness. German reports noted it with disbelief and alarm, describing a phenomenon they could neither anticipate nor fully counter. Entire formations that would have otherwise pressed the attack were neutralized in minutes, turning the tide of key engagements and contributing directly to the eventual halting of the German advance. In the final hours of the opening phase, the effect of proximity fuses was both strategic and symbolic. They represented a fusion of human ingenuity and technological advancement, a testament to the Allies' ability to innovate under the pressures of war. Where traditional artillery could inflict damage, proximity fuses instilled fear, confusion, and a sense of helplessness, demonstrating that mastery of the battlefield extended beyond numbers or firepower. It required foresight, adaptation, and a willingness to embrace revolutionary technology. German forces, confronted with a weapon they could not predict, were forced into reactive defensive maneuvers, and the psychological strain of unseen, unpredictable death contributed as much to Allied success as the physical destruction itself. By the end of the first week of the Battle of the Bulge, historians would later note, the introduction of proximity fuses had irrevocably changed the dynamics of the conflict. Entire regiments had been shattered, armored thrusts halted, and key objectives delayed. For soldiers witnessing the devastation firsthand, the fuse became a symbol of the merciless efficiency of modern warfare, a silent arbiter of life and death. Its legacy extended beyond the battlefield, influencing post-war artillery design, military strategy, and the perception of technological supremacy in combat. The Germans had been shocked, unprepared, and utterly vulnerable to a weapon that combined precision, ingenuity, and the terrifying element of surprise, a weapon that would go down in history as a decisive factor in one of the most brutal battles of World War II. The German army, confident in their blitzkrieg tactics, advanced with rapid precision across the snow-covered Ardennes, expecting to overwhelm the thinly held American lines with speed, coordination, and the psychological shock of their legendary panzer columns. Yet almost immediately they encountered an enemy they could neither see nor predict, the proximity fuse. Unlike conventional munitions, which required direct impact, these revolutionary artillery shells detonated near their targets, raining shrapnel with unerring accuracy over massed formations. Tanks, trucks, and infantry units that had moved confidently now found themselves under a silent, invisible assault that shredded their lines and disrupted command structures. The Germans, accustomed to lightning advances and coordinated assaults, suddenly faced a battlefield that seemed alive with unpredictable death. From the very first engagement, the effect on German operational planning was profound. Commanders who had relied on tight formations and rapid movement found their troops scattered, vehicles destroyed, and momentum shattered. Units that should have maintained cohesion disintegrated under the invisible bombardment, as every advance brought exposure to devastating fire. Tanks were disabled before reaching key objectives. Infantry columns were torn apart mid-march. Even well-trained officers struggled to maintain control as panic and confusion spread faster than they could issue orders. Soldiers described explosions occurring overhead with uncanny precision, shaking the snow-laden forests, sending metal fragments into the air, and leaving chaos in their wake. The psychological effect of these fuses cannot be overstated. Fear became as potent a weapon as shrapnel. Soldiers hesitated to advance, slowed their movements, and often abandoned positions to avoid the invisible threat. Artillery that once relied solely on brute force now wielded intimidation, shaping German behavior without direct contact. Unit cohesion broke down as soldiers were forced to seek cover from bursts that detonated unpredictably, making every terrain feature, from frozen streams to tree lines, a potential death trap. Morale plummeted, with seasoned veterans reporting a sense of helplessness as formations that once symbolized the might of the Wehrmacht were shattered before reaching the front. The Americans capitalized on this disruption with precision. Fire patterns were meticulously coordinated to maximize the destructive effect, using overlapping arcs to create kill zones that German troops could not penetrate. Observers calculated trajectories to exploit terrain, targeting choke points, roadways, and dense formations. Each volley not only inflicted casualties, but dictated the pace and behavior of German attacks, turning traditional offensive strategies into futile gambles. Even mechanized units, armored and imposing, were vulnerable to bursts detonating above them, overturning vehicles, or sending crews scrambling in terror. The fuse had leveled the playing field, allowing smaller American units to counteract the numerical and equipment superiority of the German advance. On the ground, the devastation was both instantaneous and cumulative. Entire regiments were fragmented. Tanks were disabled or overturned, trucks and supply vehicles destroyed, and infantry scattered. The terrain itself, once a neutral factor, now amplified the effectiveness of proximity fuses. Snow-covered fields reflected shrapnel unpredictably, forests funneled bursts into kill zones, and frozen roads exposed every moving vehicle. Medics and support personnel struggled to cope with mounting casualties, often improvising triage under artillery fire and sub-zero conditions. The fuse's impact was both physical and psychological, eroding the enemy's ability to maintain offensive operations while sustaining relentless pressure on morale. As German commanders attempted to adapt, the limitations became clear. Spreading units to reduce vulnerability reduced the cohesion required for effective blitzkrieg tactics. Attempts to move under cover or during night operations were hampered by unfamiliar terrain, poor visibility, and ongoing artillery harassment. Even elite panzer divisions found their operational plans delayed or entirely disrupted. Every failed advance compounded confusion. Communication lines were disrupted by explosions, observation posts were destroyed, and German soldiers increasingly feared the invisible threat above, rather than the forces they could see. The fuse had transformed the battlefield into a labyrinth where conventional strategy failed, and survival depended on improvisation and luck. The result was a slowing of the German offensive that had strategic consequences far beyond Bastogne. Delays allowed American reinforcements to arrive, defensive positions to be strengthened, and counterattacks to be planned. The initial shock of the proximity fuse rippled through the command hierarchy, forcing recalculations and disrupting supply lines. Historian accounts later noted that the fuse did more than destroy equipment. It destroyed confidence, created hesitation, and fundamentally altered the tempo of the Ardennes offensive. Where the German advance had promised rapid, decisive results, it now faced attrition, uncertainty, and a hidden adversary that operated with surgical precision. By the end of the second week, the fuse had earned its reputation as a game-changing innovation. It had halted blitzkrieg momentum, shattered formations, and forced German commanders into a defensive mindset. The battlefield was no longer predictable. Every snow-covered road, every ridge, every village became a potential kill zone. The Americans had leveraged technology, terrain, and tactical planning to maximize destruction while minimizing exposure. The German army, previously confident in its superiority, confronted an enemy that combined ingenuity, precision, and psychological warfare, and the results were devastating. Proximity fuses had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that battlefield innovation could decisively alter the course of history. The dense, snow-laden forests of the Ardennes, which German commanders had counted on for cover and maneuver, quickly became death traps thanks to the deadly innovation of proximity fuses. Unlike conventional artillery, which relied on direct hits, these fuses detonated above or near enemy positions, showering troops and armored columns with lethal shrapnel. German soldiers, trained in maneuver warfare, found themselves disoriented and terrified, as formations that had once allowed rapid movement were shredded mid-advance. The trees, once considered shields against observation and fire, now funneled explosions, creating unpredictable arcs that magnified the destruction. Every ridge, clearing, and road through the forest became a potential death zone, turning the landscape itself into an accomplice of annihilation. From the first volleys, the Germans faced a shock unlike any they had experienced. Infantry columns advancing through frozen paths were cut down in waves, vehicles were overturned or reduced to flaming wrecks, and command posts were shattered by bursts that detonated above or beside them. Panic spread quickly, as soldiers struggled to maintain cohesion while avoiding invisible threats from the sky. Even officers in armored vehicles were not immune. The explosions tore through cover, forcing leaders to abandon control and retreat to survive. The forest, once an ally for concealment, now amplified fear, confusion, and destruction. Each soldier was acutely aware that a single step or wrong turn could place them directly under the deadly arc of a detonation. The American artillery teams orchestrated this devastation with meticulous precision. Observers adjusted fire patterns to create overlapping kill zones that forced German troops into predictable paths, only to meet shrapnel explosions with surgical timing. Trees, ridges, and frozen rivers were leveraged to magnify the fuse's lethality. The combination of human calculation and technological innovation created a battlefield where German commanders could not trust the terrain, and every advance became a gamble with survival. Tanks attempting to navigate the forest were crushed by explosions above, while infantry was torn apart even before reaching defensive positions. Each encounter eroded morale, forcing hesitation and disarray that amplified the physical destruction. Psychological warfare became as important as physical destruction. Soldiers reported that the forest itself seemed alive, attacking in ways that defied comprehension. Artillery bursts rained unpredictably, shrapnel slicing through snow-covered ground and timber alike. Morale declined sharply, as even veteran soldiers struggled to reconcile the lethal efficiency of a weapon they could neither see nor fully anticipate. Hesitation, fear, and confusion spread through the German ranks faster than any artillery barrage, turning their advance into a series of fractured, chaotic movements that left them vulnerable to further destruction. The proximity fuse had redefined what it meant to face modern artillery. It was as much about control, fear, and timing as it was about raw firepower. Tactical adaptations by the Germans were largely ineffective. Attempts to disperse infantry and stagger tanks reduced vulnerability slightly, but also undermined the cohesion needed for effective blitzkrieg maneuvers. Night advances offered some cover, but even darkness could not hide the shadows and trajectories of detonation, and snow reflected explosions in ways that made concealment nearly impossible. Attempts to shield tanks and trucks behind trees or ridges offered limited protection, and the psychological impact of facing invisible, omnipresent death further diminished operational effectiveness. Soldiers moved cautiously, slowing the tempo of operations and allowing American forces to maintain control of the battlefield. Medics and support units faced extraordinary challenges. Frozen terrain, snow, and debris compounded the difficulty of reaching wounded soldiers. Evacuation under constant artillery fire became a harrowing endeavor, with stretcher bearers risking life and limb to save comrades. Yet even amidst these struggles, the ingenuity of the Americans ensured maximum effect. Fire coordination, timing, and observation allowed the fuses to continue devastating German forces while minimizing exposure of their own troops. Every explosion reinforced the terror, reshaping the battlefield and demonstrating that technological innovation, combined with strategic application, could outmatch even the most disciplined enemy. By the third day of engagement, the cumulative effect of proximity fuses in the Ardennes forests was undeniable. German units, previously confident in their mobility and tactics, were fragmented and demoralized. Tanks were immobilized or destroyed, infantry scattered, and command structures disrupted. The forest that had promised concealment became an amplifier of destruction, a testament to how modern warfare had evolved beyond simple firepower. The fuse had turned terrain into a weapon, and every soldier who survived could testify that the unseen, omnipresent threat above was as lethal as the enemy itself. Historians later described these encounters as pivotal. The forests of Ardennes, once considered advantageous for maneuver, were transformed into lethal arenas where technology, strategy, and human calculation converged. Proximity fuses did more than inflict casualties. They destroyed confidence, forced operational pauses, and ensured that German momentum was irreversibly stalled. The psychological and tactical impact reverberated through every echelon of command, proving that innovation in artillery could decisively alter the battlefield and shape the outcome of one of the most famous engagements in World War II. By the time the Battle of the Bulge reached its critical stages, it was clear that proximity fuses had achieved something unprecedented. They had neutralized terrain advantages, shattered elite formations, and turned fear itself into a weapon. German commanders struggled to comprehend how massed units, once the pride of blitzkrieg strategy, could be reduced to chaos by invisible, precisely timed explosions. The Ardennes forests, silent witnesses to the carnage, bore the marks of this lethal technology, forever illustrating the devastating interplay between human ingenuity, technological advancement, and the unforgiving art of war. By the second week of the Battle of the Bulge, the deadly efficiency of proximity fuses had reached a terrifying crescendo. German forces, initially confident in their ability to crush American defenses with blitzkrieg speed, found themselves confronting devastation on a scale that defied comprehension. Entire battalions, tanks, trucks, and infantry units were obliterated within minutes, their carefully coordinated advances reduced to chaos and ruin. Where commanders had planned swift, precise movements, all that remained was smoke, fire, and the shattered remnants of elite formations. The psychological impact was staggering. Soldiers who had faced the fiercest engagements in Europe were now paralyzed by fear. Hesitant to advance even when strategically essential, the mechanics of the fuse amplified the carnage. Designed to explode in proximity to masked targets rather than upon direct impact, these munitions ensured that tightly packed formations, once a tactical advantage, became death traps. Tanks were lifted or ripped apart by overhead detonations. Infantry units disintegrated in clouds of metal fragments. Transport convoys were transformed into flaming obstacles. German commanders attempted to adapt by spreading their forces and using terrain as cover, yet these measures often reduced cohesion, slowed momentum, and ultimately increased vulnerability. The closer they came to the front lines, the more devastating the results, as the unseen artillery bursts struck with surgical precision, turning the battlefield into a lethal chessboard where every piece moved under constant threat. The American artillery teams orchestrated this mass destruction with meticulous coordination. Fire patterns were staggered and overlapping, creating continuous zones of lethal coverage. Observers calculated altitude, trajectory, and timing to ensure maximum effect, often adjusting fire in real time as German movements unfolded. Batteries worked in synchronization, turning each shell into a directed instrument of chaos. The result was catastrophic for the Germans. Formations that had once represented operational strength were shattered before they could execute maneuvers. Armored thrusts slowed to a crawl, and the initiative shifted entirely into American hands. The fuse had transformed artillery from a blunt instrument into a strategic scalpel, capable of dismantling enemy plans with terrifying efficiency. On the ground, the human cost was immense. Soldiers were caught in open fields, roads, and frozen rivers with nowhere to hide from detonations above. Tanks were engulfed in fireballs. Trucks and half-tracks were torn apart, leaving survivors scrambling for cover. Even experienced infantry units accustomed to rapid movements and coordinated attacks were decimated, forced into scattered defensive pockets. Medical personnel struggled under freezing temperatures and constant fire, improvising triage for a relentless influx of casualties. The landscape was scarred by craters, overturned vehicles, and the remnants of human and mechanical destruction, a stark visual testament to the fuse's power. The psychological impact amplified the physical destruction. Fear spread through units as soldiers recognized the lethality of massed movements. Hesitation became the norm. Previously confident tank commanders and infantry officers second-guessed every maneuver, aware that a single miscalculation could result in annihilation. Morale plummeted, and the once cohesive German offensive slowed dramatically. The proximity fuse had not only inflicted casualties, it had eroded confidence, fractured command, and instilled a pervasive sense of vulnerability, turning battlefield success into a dangerous gamble. Attempts at tactical adaptation often failed. German commanders tried to stagger troops, advance under cover, or conduct night operations, yet each measure only partially mitigated the lethal effect. Trees, ridges, and terrain that had offered protection in previous engagements were now deadly conduits for shrapnel and blast waves. Tanks attempting to maneuver through tight passes were lifted, overturned, or destroyed by bursts detonating above. Convoys scattered, losing cohesion and leaving personnel exposed. The cumulative effect of these strategies was frustration, attrition, and irreversible delay, giving American forces a decisive edge in both time and psychological advantage. Strategically, the fuse reshaped the entire German offensive. Objectives meant to be seized quickly were delayed, supply lines disrupted, and elite formations reduced to fragmented units incapable of coordinated action. Commanders faced a paradox. Concentration increased vulnerability while dispersion undermined offensive power. Every attack became a perilous gamble, every advance slowed by fear of invisible death overhead. The proximity fuse had effectively neutralized traditional blitzkrieg tactics, forcing the Germans into reactive, defensive behavior that bought precious time for reinforcements and counterattacks. By the end of Point 4 engagements, it was clear that the fuse had achieved unprecedented destruction. Entire formations that would have otherwise overwhelmed American defenses were annihilated before reaching the line. The battlefield had been transformed into a lethal, unpredictable arena where technology, precision, and psychological warfare converged. Soldiers who survived spoke of terror unlike any previous combat experience, as the fuse ensured that no advance was safe, no formation immune, and no strategy infallible. The mass destruction wrought by this invisible weapon reshaped the Battle of the Bulge, demonstrating that modern innovation, combined with careful coordination, could decisively turn the tide of war. While the physical devastation caused by proximity fuses was staggering, the psychological impact on German troops during the Battle of the Bulge was equally catastrophic. Soldiers, trained and disciplined in blitzkrieg tactics, suddenly faced an invisible enemy that struck without warning, disintegrating formations, overturning tanks, and scattering infantry in a matter of seconds. The very nature of these fuses, detonating in proximity rather than on impact, created a sense of omnipresent threat, where every advance, every movement, and every attempt to regroup could trigger instant annihilation. Even veteran commanders, hardened by years of campaign, were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. The battlefield itself had become unpredictable and hostile, turning fear into an instrument of war. Reports from the front lines reveal a landscape of confusion and panic. Infantry units hesitated to move, tanks slowed to cautious paces, and communication lines became unreliable as soldiers ducked and scattered to avoid overhead bursts. The once feared German blitzkrieg formations, which relied on speed, cohesion, and surprise, were rendered ineffective by the invisible, omnipresent threat. Officers struggled to maintain control, often shouting commands over the roar of explosions while trying to prevent total disintegration of their units. The psychological weight of facing an enemy that could strike without being seen or heard before detonation was unlike anything soldiers had previously experienced. The Americans exploited this mental strain with meticulous strategy. Artillery fire was carefully timed and calculated to maximize disruption, targeting choke points, forested paths, and frozen roads where enemy troops were forced to advance. Observers ensured overlapping arcs of fire, creating zones of continuous threat that prevented reformation or coordination. The Germans, caught between terrain limitations and the omnipresent danger of detonating shells, were left with no safe options. Hesitation and confusion multiplied casualties. Soldiers who might have resisted under normal circumstances became paralyzed by fear. Their movements slow, erratic, and predictable, making them even more vulnerable to further artillery bursts. This psychological warfare extended beyond mere fear. Commanders at higher echelons were forced to constantly recalculate strategies, redistribute units, and adapt to the unpredictable destruction below. Even elite armored divisions found that planning and communication were compromised as units were fragmented and morale deteriorated. Letters and diaries from German soldiers describe a sense of helplessness, a pervasive dread that eroded initiative and shattered confidence in their own leadership. The proximity fuse had not just killed, it had undermined the very structure of the offensive, turning coordination and cohesion into fleeting illusions. On the American side, soldiers recognized that the fuse's value went beyond tactical destruction. Its ability to terrorize and destabilize the enemy allowed smaller units to hold positions against superior numbers, disrupted German timing, and provided critical moments for reinforcements to arrive. Every burst not only inflicted casualties but amplified hesitation, confusion, and mistakes within German ranks. Artillery became as much a weapon of the mind as of metal, creating a battlefield where uncertainty was lethal, and fear multiplied the fuse's effectiveness. The cumulative effect on the German offensive was profound. Units that had been expected to advance decisively were slowed, delayed, or diverted entirely. Tactical plans unraveled under the dual pressures of physical destruction and psychological strain. Even as the Germans attempted to regroup, the constant threat of invisible detonation above made every decision fraught with danger. Soldiers became increasingly reliant on cover, coordination suffered, and momentum was irreversibly lost. The proximity fuse had transformed the battlefield into a theater of terror, where survival depended as much on nerve as on strategy or equipment. Historical analyses later emphasized that the fuse's psychological impact was decisive. By undermining morale, scattering formations, and creating pervasive fear, it complemented physical destruction to achieve effects far beyond traditional artillery. German units, confronted with an invisible, omnipresent threat, faced a form of attrition that no previous tactic had delivered. The Battle of the Bulge, already a brutal winter engagement, became a crucible where technology and human psychology intertwined to redefine combat. The invisible terror overhead ensured that the Germans were never fully in control. Their actions dictated as much by fear as by orders. By the conclusion of Point 5, the Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated a new paradigm in modern warfare. That technology, when combined with strategic ingenuity, could shape not just outcomes, but the very behavior of enemy soldiers. Proximity fuses did not merely destroy, they destabilized, paralyzed, and rewrote operational effectiveness. Where numbers and equipment had once determined battlefield superiority, now innovation, coordination, and psychological leverage dictated victory. The Germans, stunned and fragmented, faced a force that operated with both visible and invisible power, leaving them unprepared, disoriented, and vulnerable to further destruction. As the Battle of the Bulge reached its climax, the full staggering impact of proximity fuses became undeniable. German forces, once confident in their ability to sweep through the Ardennes with lightning speed, had been reduced to fragmented, hesitant, and demoralized units. Entire regiments were shattered, armored columns halted, and infantry formations scattered under the relentless, invisible threat of explosions above. The American artillery teams, meticulously calculating trajectories and timing, had turned the once feared German blitzkrieg machine into a spectacle of chaos and destruction. Soldiers on both sides witnessed a transformation of the battlefield, where terrain, technology, and human ingenuity converged to create a new reality, one in which the enemy could not anticipate the lethal arcs raining from the sky. From frozen forests to snow-covered roads, Every corner of the Ardennes bore the marks of devastation. Tanks were overturned or shattered mid-column, trucks and half-tracks engulfed in fire, and infantry decimated by clouds of metal fragments. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion. Communication lines were severed, morale collapsed, and operational plans crumbled in the face of unpredictable destruction. Yet even amid this devastation, the Americans leveraged the fuse's dual power, physical annihilation, and psychological terror. The Germans were forced to advance with extreme caution, hesitate at every ridge, and react to an unseen enemy that could strike anywhere. Every moment of hesitation amplified the fuse's effectiveness, multiplying the impact of every artillery barrage. The proximity fuse had rewritten the rules of engagement. Where once strategy, numbers, and speed determined victory, now innovation, calculation, and psychological dominance dictated outcomes. The Germans had encountered a weapon they could not see, predict, or fully counter. A weapon that combined technological ingenuity with human coordination to produce unprecedented effects. Survivors spoke of terror unlike any previous combat experience. Commanders noted the futility of traditional tactics. Historians recognized a turning point where modern artillery reshaped the battlefield. The fuse had become a force multiplier, transforming both men and machines into instruments of fear, hesitation, and ultimate destruction. By the end of the battle, the Ardennes forests, frozen rivers, and snow-covered plains stood as silent witnesses to the devastating efficiency of proximity fuses. Entire formations that could have overwhelmed the Allies were neutralized within minutes, strategic objectives delayed or destroyed, and German morale irreparably damaged. The invisible power above dictated the pace, direction, and outcome of the offensive, proving that mastery of modern warfare required more than brute strength. It demanded ingenuity, foresight, and the willingness to harness innovation decisively. The Germans, stunned and demoralized, had been defeated not only by firepower, but by a revolutionary combination of human skill and technological brilliance. In the final hours of the Ardennes offensive, the effect of proximity fuses was as clear as it was terrifying. The battlefield belonged to the Americans. The invisible arcs of death had shattered formations, broken morale, and secured a decisive tactical advantage. Where chaos reigned, discipline and calculation prevailed. Where fear spread, innovation triumphed. The Battle of the Bulge had revealed a new paradigm in warfare, that invisible, precisely timed destruction could shape the course of history, cement victory, and leave even the most confident adversary stunned, demoralized, and utterly defeated. Proximity fuses had done more than destroy. They had rewritten the rules of modern combat, leaving an enduring legacy of ingenuity, strategy, and unstoppable power.